Cocaine is a molecule that was never meant to leave a mountain, and yet it now bends the modern world around its chemistry. Born in the thin oxygen of the Andes, it escapes its quiet leaf, detonates through global trade networks, slips past borders and satellites, and lands inside a human brain with the force of a lightning strike. This is the epic, scientific odyssey of a compound that moves faster than law, reshapes cities, rewires reward circuits, and turns ordinary physiology into something electric, dangerous, and unforgettable. From volcanic soil to synapse, from ancient ritual to modern obsession, this is the complete story of how one molecule became a global force of nature. High in the Andes Mountains, where the air grows thin and the world seems to touch the edge of sky, dawn arrives slowly. The sun rises over peaks that have stood for millions of years, their slopes draped in mist that moves like breath across the valleys. Here, where the altitude makes every step deliberate and every breath conscious, a plant has grown for thousands upon thousands of years. It is a small shrub, unremarkable to the untrained eye, with oval leaves that catch the early light and turn it into something living. This is Erythroxylum coca, the coca plant, and it has been part of these mountains longer than any human memory can reach. Its roots sink into volcanic soil enriched by ancient eruptions, drawing up minerals that the plant transforms, molecule by molecule, into the substance of its leaves. The coca plant is not aggressive in its growth. It does not tower over other vegetation or spread with invasive urgency. Instead, it occupies a particular ecological niche, thriving at altitudes between 1,500 and 2,000 meters, where the air pressure is lower and the oxygen content drops below what most plants require. The evolutionary story of the coca plant unfolds slowly across millions of years. Like all living things, it emerged through countless generations of adaptation, each small change in its genetic code tested by the environment, kept or discarded based on whether it helped the plant survive. And somewhere in this deep history, the coca plant developed the ability to produce alkaloids, complex nitrogen-containing compounds that accumulate in its leaves. These alkaloids serve the plant as a form of protection, a chemical defense against the insects and herbivores that might otherwise consume it. The bitter taste, the slight numbing sensation these compounds produce, discourage many creatures from eating the leaves. Among these alkaloids, one molecule stands out in its complexity and its effect, a compound that would later be named cocaine, after the plant itself. But for thousands of years before that naming, before the molecule was isolated or understood, indigenous peoples of the Andes knew the coca leaf intimately. They chewed the leaves slowly, mixed with a small amount of alkaline substance from ash or lime, which helped release the plant's active compounds. This practice was woven into the fabric of daily life, used to ease the challenges of living at altitude where the air is thin and work is hard. The coca leaf was sacred and ordinary at once. It was offered in ceremonies, used in healing practices, and carried by travelers crossing mountain passes. When you chew coca leaves at high altitude, the effect is subtle, a gentle suppression of hunger, a slight easing of fatigue, a mild stimulation that helps the body cope with reduced oxygen. The indigenous peoples understood this plant not as something to be conquered or transformed, but as a gift from the landscape itself, a relationship between human and plant that had existed for so long it felt as natural as the mountains. In the cool morning air of the Andes, dew collects on coca leaves in tiny droplets that catch the light. The plant photosynthesizes slowly as the sun rises higher, converting light into energy, pulling carbon dioxide from the thin air, releasing oxygen molecule by molecule. Inside each leaf, in the cellular machinery that operates beyond human sight, alkaloids are being synthesized through complex biochemical pathways. The plant does not know what it creates. It simply follows the instructions written in its genes, instructions shaped by millions of years of survival. The coca plant flowers with small, pale blooms that attract specific pollinators. It produces red berries that contain seeds, though much of coca cultivation now happens through cuttings rather than seeds. The plant can live for decades if tended properly, and a mature coca bush can be harvested several times a year. The leaves are picked by hand, carefully, in a practice that has changed remarkably little over centuries. There is a rhythm to this harvest, a knowledge of which leaves are ready, which should be left to grow longer. Archaeological evidence suggests that coca use in the Andes dates back at least 8,000 years. Ancient mummies have been found with coca leaves placed in burial sites. Pottery from pre-Columbian civilizations shows coca leaves in ceremonial contexts. The plant was so integrated into Andean culture that when Spanish colonizers arrived in the 16th century, they encountered a relationship between people and plant that had no European equivalent. Some missionaries initially condemned coca use, but eventually, the practical value of the leaf, its ability to help workers endure the brutal conditions in mines and high-altitude labor, led to its acceptance and even its taxation by colonial authorities. But in those ancient times, before any European had seen these mountains, the coca plant simply grew. It responded to the seasons, to the rainfall, to the particular mineral content of the soil in each valley. Birds nested in nearby trees. Insects navigated between plants. The ecosystem existed in a balance that had been calibrated over thousands of years. The coca plant was one species among many, neither good nor evil, simply present, simply alive, producing in its leaves a molecule of remarkable complexity. As dawn gives way to full morning in the Andes, the temperature rises slightly, though these mountains are never truly warm. The coca leaves continue their quiet work of photosynthesis, building sugars, producing alkaloids, growing imperceptibly day by day. This is where the story begins, not with human intention or scientific ambition, but with a plant adapted to thin air and high altitude, producing compounds that happen to affect the human nervous system in profound ways. The ancient leaf holds within it a chemistry that humans would eventually isolate, study, transform, and transport across the entire world. But first, there was simply this: a plant, a mountain, the slow accumulation of molecules and green leaves under the equatorial sun. If you could shrink yourself down to the molecular scale and enter a coca leaf, you would find yourself in a world of intricate machinery, of chemical reactions proceeding with careful precision. The inside of a plant cell is a crowded place, full of organelles and membranes, proteins folding into specific shapes, and molecules moving along concentration gradients. In the coca leaf, among all the ordinary chemistry of photosynthesis and growth, something unusual is happening. The plant is manufacturing alkaloids. Alkaloids are a class of naturally occurring compounds found throughout the plant kingdom. They contain nitrogen atoms incorporated into complex ring structures, and they almost always have powerful effects on animal nervous systems. Plants don't produce alkaloids by accident. These compounds require significant metabolic energy to synthesize, which means they must provide some evolutionary advantage that justifies the cost. That advantage is usually defense alkaloids tend to be bitter or toxic, discouraging herbivores from eating the plants that produce them. The coca plant produces several alkaloids, but the primary one, the one present in the highest concentration, is cocaine. The word itself comes from the plant's name, coined when the compound was first isolated in the mid-19th century. But long before anyone extracted or named it, cocaine molecules were being assembled inside coca leaf cells through a series of biochemical reactions so complex that scientists are still mapping all the details. The synthesis begins with common plant metabolites, amino acids, and sugars that every plant produces. Through a cascade of enzymatic reactions, these simple starting materials are gradually transformed. One enzyme adds a chemical group here, another removes one there. Molecules are joined and split and rearranged. Each step is catalyzed by a specific protein enzyme, shaped precisely to facilitate one particular reaction. The pathway branches and converges, building molecular complexity piece by piece. What makes cocaine unusual as an alkaloid is its chemical structure. It's actually an ester, a compound formed from an acid and an alcohol combined with a complex nitrogen-containing ring system. This particular arrangement of atoms gives cocaine its specific properties: its solubility in both water and fat, its ability to cross biological membranes, its interaction with particular proteins in the human brain. But the plant doesn't create this molecule for human purposes. The coca plant manufactures cocaine because, somewhere in its evolutionary history, plants with higher concentrations of this particular alkaloid were less likely to be eaten, more likely to survive and reproduce, gradually becoming the dominant form. The concentration of alkaloids in coca leaves isn't constant. It varies with growing conditions, with the season, with the age of the plant and the position of the leaf on the stem. Young leaves at the top of the plant often contain higher alkaloid levels than older leaves lower down. Plants grown at different altitudes produce leaves with different chemical profiles. The soil's mineral content matters. Certain nutrients affect the plant's metabolism in ways that change alkaloid production. Sunlight intensity, rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations throughout the day. All of these environmental factors influence the chemistry unfolding inside each leaf. This is a principle you see throughout nature. Plants are chemical factories, and their output depends on their growing conditions. Coffee plants produce more caffeine when stressed. Opium poppies in different climates produce varying ratios of morphine and other alkaloids. The coca plant is no different. A coca leaf grown in one valley might contain 0.7% cocaine by dry weight, while a leaf from another region might contain nearly 1%. These differences seem small, but at the molecular scale, they're significant. The cocaine molecule itself is stable at room temperature. Once produced inside the leaf cell, it tends to remain there, accumulated in vacuoles, storage compartments within the cell. When indigenous peoples chew coca leaves, they're accessing this stored alkaloid, the alkaline substance they mix with the leaves, ash from certain plants, or lime from ground shells raises the pH and helps the cocaine cross from the leaf tissue into the mouth's mucous membranes, where it can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Without this alkaline addition, much of the cocaine would remain locked in the plant tissue, passing through the digestive system without much effect. This chemical relationship between plant and human has existed for thousands of years, a relationship mediated by molecules. The coca plant doesn't intend to affect human consciousness. It simply produces compounds that happen to interact with mammalian nervous systems in specific ways. The fact that these compounds are potent, that they produce noticeable effects, is an accident of chemical structure. The particular shape and electronic properties of the cocaine molecule happen to fit certain protein receptors in the brain, like a key, fitting a lock. Other alkaloids in the coca leaf include compounds with names like cinnamoyl cocaine, methylecgonine, and benzoylecgonine. Each has a slightly different structure. Each interacts with the body in slightly different ways, but none is as potent or present in such quantities as cocaine itself. When researchers first began studying coca leaves in the 19th century, they were struck by the consistency of cocaine's presence. No matter which variety of coca plant they examined, no matter where it was grown, cocaine was always the dominant alkaloid. Understanding the chemistry inside the coca leaf requires patience. Each molecule represents thousands of atomic bonds, each bond the result of electrons shared between atoms according to the laws of quantum mechanics. The enzyme that facilitates one step in cocaine synthesis might consist of thousands of amino acids folded into a specific three-dimensional shape, with an active site precisely configured to hold substrate molecules in the correct orientation for a reaction to occur. The complexity is profound, and yet it all happens automatically, driven by nothing more than chemical potential energy and the principles of thermodynamics. As evening comes to the Andes and the temperature drops, the metabolism of the coca plant slows. Photosynthesis decreases as light fades. The production of alkaloids continues, but at a reduced rate. Inside each leaf cell, cocaine molecules remain stable, waiting. They will wait days, weeks, months if necessary, stable, potent, ready. The ancient chemistry that produced them required millions of years to evolve, but now it proceeds automatically, generation after generation. In every coca plant growing in these mountains, the leaf has become a repository of complex molecules, a concentration of chemical potential that humans would eventually learn to extract, purify, and transform in ways the plant never intended, if intention can be ascribed to something as ancient and unconscious as a plant's evolutionary chemistry. The Andes Mountains rise along the western edge of South America like a spine, stretching more than 7,000 kilometers from Venezuela to Chile. This is one of the world's great mountain ranges, formed by the collision of tectonic plates, pushed upward over millions of years as the Nazca Plate slides beneath the South American plate. The result is a landscape of dramatic elevation changes, of peaks that reach above 6,000 meters, of valleys carved by ancient glaciers and rivers that rush down steep gradients toward distant oceans. In this vast mountain range, coca plants grow in specific zones, occupying an ecological niche defined by altitude, temperature, and rainfall. They don't grow at the very highest elevations where only grasses and hardy shrubs survive. They don't grow in the hot lowlands, where different plants dominate. Instead, they thrive in the transition zones, the cloud forests and montane slopes where mist is common and the air is cool but not freezing, where rainfall is regular but not overwhelming. These regions are remarkably isolated. Travel through the Andes has always been difficult. The terrain is vertical. You don't travel across valleys. You climb out of them and descend into the next one. Roads are recent developments, carved with considerable effort into mountainsides. For most of human history, movement through these mountains meant walking narrow paths, using pack animals adapted to altitude, accepting that distances that look short on a map could take days to traverse. This isolation has profound biological consequences. Ecosystems in mountain valleys often evolve independently from nearby valleys separated by high ridges. Species diverge. Plants adapt to local conditions. The Andes are one of the world's biodiversity hotspots, containing an extraordinary number of species found nowhere else on Earth. The spectacled bear, the vicuña, hundreds of bird species, thousands of plant species, many exist only in these mountains, evolved in isolation over thousands of generations. The coca plant fits into this pattern of endemic species, while different varieties of Erythroxylum coca exist, and while the plant has been cultivated in some other tropical regions, the Andes remain its ancestral home. The plant is adapted to these specific conditions: the soil chemistry derived from volcanic bedrock, the temperature patterns of equatorial mountains, the rainfall carried by winds from the Amazon basin that rise and cool as they encounter the eastern slopes of the range. Climate in these mountains is determined by altitude more than by latitude. You can experience multiple climate zones by simply walking up or down a mountainside. At lower elevations, the vegetation is lush, almost tropical. As you climb, the forest changes, different tree species, different understory plants, different patterns of growth. Higher still, the forest gives way to grasslands, then to bare rock and permanent snow. Each zone has its own temperature range, its own moisture regime, its own community of organisms adapted to those specific conditions. The coca plant occupies the zone where many factors converge favorably. Too high, and nighttime temperatures drop below freezing too often. Too low, and excessive heat stresses the plant. At its preferred altitude, temperatures remain moderate year-round. Frost is rare, and rainfall is distributed relatively evenly across seasons. These are the conditions that allow coca to thrive, that make its cultivation reliable, that have supported its presence in human agriculture for thousands of years. Water moves through these landscapes in complex patterns. Rainfall on the upper slopes feeds countless streams that merge into rivers, cutting deeper valleys as they descend. Some of these rivers flow east toward the Amazon, others flow west toward the Pacific. The watersheds are distinct, separated by high ridges that direct water in different directions. This topographic complexity creates microclimates. Some valleys receive more rainfall because they face prevailing winds. Others remain drier in rain shadows created by intervening peaks. The soil itself tells a story of volcanic activity and erosion. The Andes are geologically active, earthquakes are common, and several volcanoes remain active today. Volcanic eruptions deposit ash rich in minerals. Over time, this ash weathers into soil with particular chemical properties. Plants growing in volcanic soils access nutrients that might be scarce in other locations. The coca plant, like many Andean crops, has adapted to these soils, developing root systems and nutrient uptake patterns suited to the specific chemistry available. Remote sensing studies reveal the distribution of coca cultivation across the Andes. Satellite imagery shows cleared patches on mountainsides, regions where natural forest has been replaced by agricultural land. These cleared areas are often in zones difficult to access by road, in valleys where traditional communities have cultivated coca for generations, and where the plant remains central to local economy and culture. The remoteness provides a kind of protection. These areas are hard to monitor, hard to reach, governed more by local custom than by distant authority. The biodiversity surrounding coca cultivation is remarkable. Cloud forests in these regions contain orchids found nowhere else, frogs with brilliant colors that warn of toxic skin secretions, insects with elaborate camouflage. Birds navigate between forest layers, feeding on fruits and insects, pollinating flowers, dispersing seeds. Mammals move through the understory, small marsupials, rodents, occasionally larger animals like pumas or spectacled bears. The ecosystem is layered, complex, resilient, and ancient. In the rainy season, mist envelops these mountains for hours each day. Clouds form below you as you stand on a ridge, looking down into valleys invisible beneath white cover. Water condenses on every surface, leaves drip constantly. Moss grows thick on tree bark. The air itself feels saturated. This moisture sustains the forest, feeds the rivers, and provides the coca plant with the consistent water supply it needs. During drier months, the mist clears more often. Sunlight reaches the forest floor in shafts that illuminate floating dust and pollen, and the temperature range between day and night increases. At night, these mountains are profoundly dark, far from any city, with no artificial lights nearby. The stars appear in overwhelming numbers. The Milky Way stretches across the sky in a band of light so dense it seems three-dimensional. Constellations that gave ancient peoples their orientation appear exactly as they have for thousands of years. The cold is sharp, the silence deep except for occasional sounds a bird's call, the distant rush of a river far below, wind moving through trees. This is the geography that shapes the coca plant, the landscape that provides the conditions for its growth. These remote mountains, these isolated valleys, this vertical terrain that makes every journey difficult, all of it creates an environment where coca has thrived for millennia, largely unchanged, largely unnoticed by the wider world, until relatively recently in human history. Throughout human history, people have learned to extract useful compounds from plants. This knowledge developed slowly, passed down through generations, refined by trial and error over centuries. The basic principle is simple. Plants contain complex mixtures of chemicals, And if you can separate the active compound from the bulk plant material, you can create something more concentrated, more potent, easier to store and transport. Consider tea. When you steep tea leaves in hot water, you're performing an extraction. The water dissolves certain compounds from the leaves, caffeine, polyphenols, aromatic molecules, while leaving behind cellulose and other insoluble material. The result is a liquid that contains the tea's active ingredients in a form readily absorbed by the human body. This is one of humanity's oldest chemical techniques, developed independently in multiple cultures, applied to countless different plants. The same principle works for coffee. Grinding coffee beans increases their surface area, allowing hot water to extract caffeine, oils, and flavor compounds more efficiently. The extraction isn't complete. Most of the bean's mass remains behind as grounds, but the water carries away the compounds that produce coffee's distinctive effects and taste. This is selective extraction, using the different solubility properties of different compounds to separate what you want from what you don't. As human understanding of chemistry advanced, extraction techniques became more sophisticated. By the 19th century, scientists were isolating specific compounds from medicinal plants. From willow bark, they extracted salicylic acid, which would later be modified to create aspirin. From cinchona bark, they isolated quinine, a powerful antimalarial drug. From opium poppies, they extracted morphine, a potent analgesic. Each of these isolations required careful work grinding plant material, treating it with solvents, filtering and evaporating, crystallizing and purifying. The general approach follows similar steps regardless of which plant you're working with. First, the plant material is dried and ground to increase surface area. Then a solvent is added, something that will dissolve the desired compound. Water works for some compounds, alcohol for others. Sometimes more specialized solvents are needed. The mixture is stirred or left to sit, allowing the solvent to extract the compounds. The liquid is then separated from the solid plant material through filtering. What you have at this point is still a mixture. The solvent contains many dissolved compounds, not just the one you want. Further purification might involve changing the pH, which makes some compounds more or less soluble, causing them to separate out or remain dissolved. It might involve adding another solvent that doesn't mix with the first, creating two liquid layers that different compounds partition into based on their chemical properties. Each step removes more impurities, concentrating the desired compound. Eventually, if the process is successful, you can obtain the pure compound, often as crystals that form when the solvent evaporates. These crystals represent a tremendous concentration. A kilogram of plant material might yield just a few grams of pure compound. But those few grams are far more potent than the original plant, easier to dose precisely, stable for longer periods. This was the approach taken with coca leaves in the mid-19th century. Scientists were aware of the leaves' stimulant properties and wanted to understand what caused them. In 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Geidke isolated an alkaloid from coca leaves and called it erythroxyline. A few years later, Albert Niemann improved the extraction process and renamed the compound cocaine. His doctoral dissertation described the isolation procedure, treating coca leaves with acidified water, adding alkali to precipitate the cocaine, purifying through repeated crystallization. Once isolated, cocaine appeared as white crystals with remarkable properties. It numbed the tongue when tasted. It dissolved in both water and alcohol. It was stable at room temperature and could be stored indefinitely if kept dry. Most significantly, it had powerful effects on the nervous system, increasing alertness, suppressing fatigue, producing a sense of energy and confidence. The medical community quickly recognized cocaine's potential as a local anesthetic. When applied to mucous membranes or injected near nerves, it blocked pain signals completely. This was revolutionary. Before cocaine, surgery was agonizing, dental work was dreaded, and many medical procedures were simply too painful to perform. Cocaine changed this. Eye surgeries became possible. Dental extractions became tolerable. The compound was hailed as a miracle of modern science. For a time, cocaine was used widely in medicine. It was added to tonics and remedies. Pharmaceutical companies produced cocaine-containing preparations for various ailments. The pure compound could be precisely dosed. Unlike chewing coca leaves where the alkaloid content varied, this standardization appealed to doctors seeking reliable therapeutic effects. But cocaine's stimulant properties also led to recreational use. The boundary between medicine and recreation has always been porous. Many substances move across it as cultural attitudes and regulations change. By the early 20th century, concerns about cocaine's addictive potential led to increasing restrictions. The pure compound that had seemed so promising as a medical tool was gradually recognized as dangerous when misused. The transformation from plant to pure compound represents a profound change. Coca leaves chewed in the Andes produce mild stimulation, easily controlled, integrated into daily life without major disruption. Pure cocaine, concentrated and potent, produces effects dramatically more intense. This is a pattern seen with many plant drugs. Opium is much gentler than purified morphine or heroin. Coca leaves are much gentler than pure cocaine. The isolation of active compounds creates substances that are pharmacologically more powerful but also more dangerous, more likely to be harmful when misused. The chemistry that enables this transformation is now well understood. Modern laboratories can extract and purify plant compounds with great efficiency. The techniques have been refined over more than a century, but the fundamental principle remains the same. Use the different properties of different molecules, their solubility, their acidity or basicity, their melting points to separate them from complex mixtures. What plants produce slowly through photosynthesis and metabolism, humans can concentrate rapidly through chemistry. And so the journey of cocaine continues beyond the leaf, beyond the mountains where the plant grows. Through human intervention, the alkaloid that the plant produced as a defense becomes something else entirely, something that will travel across continents, something that will affect millions of lives, something that begins as plant chemistry but becomes, through extraction and purification, a substance that exists independent of its botanical origin. Movement across the Andes has always required patience and adaptation. The terrain resists easy passage. Mountains rise steeply. Rivers cut deep gorges. Forests grow dense in humid valleys. To travel from one region to another means following paths that wind according to the landscape's contours, paths that climb switchbacks up mountainsides and descend carefully into the valleys beyond. Traditional routes through these mountains were established over centuries. They follow the most practical lines across difficult terrain, connecting communities separated by natural barriers, enabling trade and communication despite the challenges. Some paths date back to pre-Columbian civilizations. The Inca road system, for instance, covered thousands of kilometers, engineered with remarkable skill to traverse mountain passes at high altitude, to cross rivers on suspension bridges woven from plant fibers, to make accessible a landscape that seems designed to isolate. In more recent times, roads have been carved into these mountains, though the work is difficult and expensive. Mountain roads must accommodate extreme elevation changes. They require switchbacks, hairpin turns that allow a gradual ascent or descent where a straight path would be impossibly steep. They're vulnerable to landslides during heavy rains, to washouts where streams cross them, to ice at higher elevations during cold seasons. Maintaining these roads demands constant effort. Where roads cannot go, other forms of transport continue. Mules and horses carry loads along mountain trails, their sure-footedness and strength suited to terrain that would stop most vehicles. These pack animals can navigate narrow paths, can pick their way across rocky slopes, can climb to elevations where the air is thin and every step requires more effort than it would at sea level. The pace is slow. A day's journey by mule might cover 20 or 30 kilometers, but this is movement adapted to the landscape, working with the terrain rather than trying to dominate it. Rivers provide another form of passage. In the Amazon basin, to the east of the Andes, rivers are the primary transportation corridors. The Amazon and its tributaries form a network of waterways stretching across millions of square kilometers. Some rivers are wide and slow, easily navigable by large boats. Others are narrower, faster, interrupted by rapids where boats must be portaged around dangerous water. But even these challenging rivers are often more practical than trying to move through the dense rainforest on either side. Small boats and canoes have traveled these rivers for thousands of years. Dugout canoes carved from single tree trunks can carry surprising loads. Motorboats appeared more recently, enabling faster travel but requiring fuel, which must itself be transported into remote regions. The rivers connect the mountains to the lowlands, providing routes from the Andean foothills where coca is grown down to larger towns and cities where major rivers converge. In some regions, small aircraft provide transportation where no roads exist. Simple airstrips cleared areas of relatively flat ground, long enough for a small plane to land and take off, allow access to remote locations. These planes can carry far less than a truck, but can cover in minutes distances that would take days by ground. They're expensive to operate and dependent on weather clouds and rain, frequently close mountain airstrips, making flight impossible, but they provide a connection between isolated communities and the wider world. The physics of transportation is always about energy expenditure. Moving mass requires work. The amount of work depends on the mass, the distance, and the friction or resistance encountered. Moving something uphill requires additional energy to lift it against gravity. Moving through water requires energy to overcome drag. Moving through air is even more energy intensive, requiring enough thrust to maintain flight. Each mode of transport represents a different balance of energy, speed, capacity, and cost. Coastal regions present yet another geography, where mountains meet the Pacific Ocean on South America's western coast, or where rivers empty into the Caribbean on the northern coast, or where the Atlantic coastline stretches along the east. Different opportunities for movement exist. Small boats can move along coastlines, taking advantage of currents and winds, stopping at fishing villages and small ports. Larger vessels can carry cargo in quantities impossible for any land-based transport, moving between major ports with efficiency that comes from scale. Ocean currents themselves follow patterns shaped by wind, the Earth's rotation, and temperature differences between equatorial and polar waters. These currents have been understood and used by sailors for centuries. Trade winds blow in predictable directions depending on latitude and season. Understanding these patterns allows navigation across vast distances with minimal fuel expenditure. Sailing vessels can harness wind power. Motor vessels can plan routes that take advantage of favorable currents. The geography of movement is also shaped by where people live. Cities attract goods and people because they represent concentrations of demand. Roads and shipping routes develop to connect cities to resource-producing regions. Smaller settlements along these routes serve as waypoints, places where goods are transferred between different forms of transport, where travelers rest, where information is exchanged. The network of movement across any landscape reflects the distribution of human population and economic activity. In mountainous regions, this network is constrained by terrain. You cannot simply draw a straight line from origin to destination. You must follow valleys, must climb passes at specific locations where the elevation gain is manageable, must route around obstacles. This creates patterns of movement that can seem inefficient if you're thinking in straight lines but are actually optimal given the physical constraints. Over time, certain routes become established through repeated use. They develop infrastructure storage facilities at transfer points, services for travelers, maintenance for roads or paths. Knowledge accumulates about the best times to travel, about which routes are passable in which seasons, about what challenges to expect. This institutional knowledge, passed informally from person to person, represents collective adaptation to the landscape. The Amazon rainforest presents its own transportation challenges. Vegetation grows so densely that movement through the forest itself is extremely difficult. The ground is often wet, drainage is poor in flat areas, and the canopy above blocks most sunlight from reaching the forest floor. Rivers become the logical routes they're already cleared of vegetation. They flow toward lower elevations. They can be navigated with appropriate vessels. But even river travel requires knowledge where sandbars might ground a boat, where currents are strongest, where tributaries branch and which one leads where. At night, movement in remote regions often stops. Without artificial lighting, traveling mountain paths or navigating rivers becomes dangerous. Settlements and way stations provide places to stop, to wait for daylight, to continue when visibility returns. This rhythm of movement, traveling during day, stopping at night, has been the pattern for most of human history, only recently changed by technology that allows round-the-clock operation. The geography shapes everything. It determines which routes are practical, which forms of transport make sense, how long journeys take, how much energy is required. Moving anything from remote mountain valleys to distant cities means navigating this geography, working within its constraints, using whatever combination of pack animals, boats, trucks, and planes the terrain and resources allow. The landscape is not passive. It actively shapes the patterns of human activity across it, channeling movement along certain corridors, making some destinations accessible and others extremely difficult to reach. The world's oceans cover more than 70% of the planet's surface, vast expanses of water connecting continents, following patterns of current and wind that have remained relatively stable for thousands of years. These oceans have always been highways for human movement and trade. Ships carrying goods between distant lands have sailed these waters for centuries. Their routes shaped by favorable winds, by the locations of ports, by the geography of coastlines, and the position of islands that serve as waypoints across otherwise empty water. Ocean currents flow in great circular patterns called gyres. In the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream carries warm water north along North America's eastern coast, then curves east toward Europe. The North Equatorial Current flows westward near the equator. The South Atlantic Gyre rotates counterclockwise, connecting Africa and South America. Similar patterns exist in the Pacific, where currents flow between Asia and the Americas, where the Humboldt Current brings cold water north along South America's western coast, supporting rich marine ecosystems where nutrients upwell from the deep ocean. Ships have taken advantage of these currents since the age of sail. A vessel traveling with a favorable current uses less fuel or can make faster progress under sail than one fighting against the current. Modern cargo ships still plan routes that account for ocean currents, though their powerful engines make them less dependent on these natural flows than sailing vessels were. Nevertheless, the savings in fuel and time from favorable routing remain significant, especially for the massive container ships that carry the majority of the world's ocean freight. These container ships are among the largest moving objects ever created by humans. The biggest ones are 400 meters long, capable of carrying over 20,000 shipping containers stacked both in the hold and on deck. They follow regular routes between major ports: Shenzhen to Los Angeles, Shanghai to Rotterdam, Singapore to New York, moving with the slow inevitability of structures that take kilometers to stop, that cannot maneuver quickly, that are designed purely for efficient transportation of mass across distance. A shipping container is a standardized metal box, most commonly about 6 meters long, 2.4 meters wide, and 2.4 meters tall, though larger versions exist. This standardization revolutionized global trade. Goods are loaded into containers at their origin. The container is sealed, and it moves from truck to train to ship to truck again, without its contents being unpacked until reaching final destination. The efficiency is remarkable. A modern port can load or unload thousands of containers per day using massive cranes that lift the boxes from ship to dock or from dock to ship, in smooth, continuous operations. Inside each container might be almost anything: manufactured goods, raw materials, food products, electronics, clothing, machinery. The containers are sealed and labeled with their destination and contents, tracked through global logistics systems that monitor their movement from port to port. Most pass through customs inspection only as documentation. Physical inspections of containers are selective, impossible to perform comprehensively, given the sheer volume of global trade. Customs authorities use risk assessment algorithms, intelligence information, and random sampling to decide which containers warrant physical inspection. Scanning technology helps with this process. Some ports have X-ray scanners large enough to scan entire containers without opening them. These reveal dense materials, suspicious arrangements, anomalies in the cargo. But scanning is not instantaneous. It takes time, creates bottlenecks, and cannot detect everything. Many containers pass through with only their documentation verified, their physical contents uninspected, their movement through the global supply chain as smooth and invisible as the movement of any legitimate cargo. Port cities are nodes in this global network. Places like Rotterdam, Singapore, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, cities that have grown around their harbors, that serve as transfer points between ocean shipping and land transportation, that process millions of containers annually. These ports operate continuously, ships arriving and departing around the clock, cranes working day and night, trucks streaming in and out in endless lines. The scale is industrial, the efficiency remarkable, the complexity managed through sophisticated logistics software that coordinates the movement of goods from ships that might spend just hours in port before departing for their next destination. From these major ports, cargo distributes inland. Smaller ships carry containers to regional ports. Trucks transport them to warehouses and distribution centers. Railways move them across continents. The network branches repeatedly, each level of branching moving cargo closer to final destinations, until individual containers are delivered to warehouses, stores, or facilities that will unpack them and distribute their contents further. The global supply chain is both robust and vulnerable. It's robust because it's massively redundant. Goods can move along many different routes, through different ports, adapting to disruptions. It's vulnerable because it's so complex and interdependent. A disruption at a major port can cascade through the system, causing delays and shortages far away. The system operates with remarkable efficiency most of the time, but that efficiency comes from tight coordination, minimal redundancy, and optimization that leaves little slack for when things go wrong. International borders exist within this system as regulatory control points. Customs authorities monitor what crosses borders, enforcing laws about what may or may not be imported, collecting duties and taxes, preventing the entry of prohibited materials. But the sheer volume of global trade makes comprehensive enforcement impossible. Authorities must be selective, strategic, focused on highest risk shipments while allowing the vast majority to flow through with minimal delay. Smaller vessels navigate different patterns. Fishing boats, private yachts, cargo ships, too small for standardized containers. These move between smaller ports, along coastlines, sometimes far from major shipping lanes. They're harder to monitor, often operating in regions with limited surveillance, subject to less scrutiny than ships arriving at major commercial ports. Some coastal waters are vast and difficult to patrol comprehensively. The Caribbean Sea, the Mediterranean, The waters around Southeast Asia all contain thousands of islands, countless small harbors, endless miles of coastline. Air cargo represents another vector of global movement. Aircraft can cross oceans in hours, can transport goods between continents faster than any ship. But aircraft carry far less than ships, where a container ship might carry hundreds of thousands of tons. A large cargo aircraft carries maybe 100 tons. Air freight is expensive, used for goods where speed matters more than cost, time-sensitive products, high-value items, materials needed urgently. Major international airports serve as hubs, with cargo facilities separate from passenger terminals, where goods are transferred between flights, where customs inspections occur, where the flow continues toward final destinations. The physics of all this movement is about overcoming distance and friction. Ocean shipping is efficient because water provides a low-friction medium. Once a ship is moving, relatively little energy is needed to maintain speed. Air transport is fast but energy-intensive. Keeping aircraft aloft requires continuous thrust to overcome gravity and air resistance. Ground transport varies. Trains are efficient for mass over distance on land. Trucks more flexible but less efficient. Each mode has its niche, determined by the economics of energy, speed, and capacity. Navigation across oceans relies on GPS and electronic charts now, but the principles remain those developed over centuries of seafaring. A ship maintains course by reference to its position, adjusts for winds and currents, monitors weather systems that might affect passage. Storm systems form over tropical waters, following seasonal patterns, gaining strength as they move across warm ocean surfaces. Ships route around severe weather when possible, slow or alter course when storms are unavoidable, accepting delays that safety requires. At night, the oceans are dark beyond measure, far from any coastline, with no lights but the ship's own. The stars appear with the same overwhelming clarity as in remote mountains. The ocean's surface reflects starlight when calm, becomes invisible turbulence when rough. Navigation lights from other ships appear as moving points of light, their distance and direction judged by experienced eyes. The global network of maritime traffic continues through darkness and daylight, through calm and storm, moving cargo in patterns that connect every inhabited continent, enabling the flow of goods that has become essential to modern civilization. Cities are among humanity's most complex creations. Dense concentrations of people, buildings, infrastructure, and activity, occupying relatively small geographic areas, but exerting influence far beyond their boundaries. From above, cities appear as intricate patterns of streets and structures, lights that glow brighter as day fades, networks of roads radiating outward like capillaries from arteries. Millions of people might live within an area of just a few hundred square kilometers, each pursuing individual lives that collectively create patterns too complex for any single person to fully comprehend. The ecology of cities is unique. Unlike natural ecosystems shaped purely by evolutionary processes, cities are built environments, designed with human purposes in mind. Yet they function in some ways like ecosystems. Energy flows through them, materials circulate, waste accumulates, populations grow and decline according to forces that resemble natural selection. Neighborhoods rise and fall in economic fortune. Buildings are constructed, inhabited, abandoned, demolished, and replaced. The city itself is never static but constantly in flux, responding to economic pressures, demographic changes, and individual decisions that aggregate into collective transformation. Human beings cluster in cities for reasons that are both ancient and modern. Cities offer opportunities for work, for trade, for social connection, for access to services and resources. The density enables specialization. In a small village, everyone must be somewhat self-sufficient, but in a city, people can specialize deeply, knowing that specialists in other fields provide what they don't produce themselves. This specialization creates efficiency and wealth, drawing more people who seek those benefits, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of growth. But cities also create anonymity. In a small community, everyone knows everyone, social ties are strong, and behavior is constrained by reputation and relationship. In a city, you walk past thousands of strangers daily, most of whom you'll never see again. This anonymity enables freedom from constant social observation, freedom to pursue interests that might be judged in smaller communities, but it also weakens certain forms of social control. The rules are formal rather than informal, enforced by institutions rather than by face-to-face relationships. The anthropology of cities reveals patterns that repeat across cultures. Markets emerge places where goods are exchanged, where buyers and sellers converge, where prices are negotiated. These might be physical spaces like street markets or bazaars, or they might be abstract networks of transactions occurring through digital means. Entertainment districts develop areas where people gather for recreation, for music and food, for social interaction outside the structures of work and home. Residential neighborhoods sort by income and culture, creating distinct areas with different characteristics, different populations, different relationships to the broader urban environment. Transportation networks connect these districts. Subway systems move masses of people underground, following routes determined by engineering constraints and by the density of destinations. Bus routes web across surface streets. Roads carry private vehicles and taxis, their flow regulated by traffic lights, by signs, by the informal cooperation of drivers navigating shared space. During peak hours, these systems strain under maximum load, trains packed, roads congested, the city's circulatory system working at capacity to move millions of people from where they are to where they need to be. The demand for certain goods and services concentrates in cities because of the concentrated population. Where millions of people live in proximity, even niche markets have enough customers to be viable. Restaurants serving cuisine from dozens of countries exist because the city contains immigrant communities large enough to support them, and curious populations willing to try them. Specialized stores, unusual services, obscure professionals all find sufficient demand in cities that would leave them without customers in smaller populations. This concentration of demand applies to all goods, including those that society attempts to restrict. Cities have always been places where prohibited goods and services find markets. The anonymity, the density, the complex social networks, the sheer number of potential customers, all of these factors make cities attractive for trade that operates outside legal frameworks. Throughout history, cities have been centers not only for legitimate commerce, but for black markets, underground economies, and networks that move goods society tries to restrict. The sociology of demand is complex. Why do people seek certain substances? The reasons vary: curiosity, social pressure, the desire for altered consciousness, self-medication for pain or psychological distress, the pursuit of pleasure or escape. Young adults often experiment with substances as part of identity formation, testing boundaries, exploring experiences. Established users might maintain habits formed over years. Social contexts shape use nightclubs and parties, create environments where stimulant use seems normative, where the chemical's effects align with the social goal of prolonged energetic interaction. Cities provide the social contexts where such use concentrates. Nightlife districts, entertainment zones, areas where young people gather. These become locations where demand is highest, where the social environment encourages certain behaviors, where substances that enhance those behaviors find ready markets. The city doesn't create demand from nothing, but it concentrates and amplifies it, bringing together populations who seek similar experiences, creating subcultures where particular substance use becomes integrated into social identity. Public health researchers study these patterns, trying to understand the epidemiology of substance use. They map usage rates across different neighborhoods, across different demographic groups. They find that use correlates with certain factors: age, income, employment status, social environment. Young adults show higher rates than older populations. Areas with active nightlife show higher rates than quiet residential neighborhoods. Economic stress correlates with use in some contexts, affluence in others. The patterns are complex, refusing to reduce to simple explanations. The built environment itself shapes behavior. Dark streets and isolated areas create spaces where illegal activity is less visible. Well-lit public spaces with regular foot traffic discourage it. The design of buildings, the layout of streets, the presence or absence of windows and eyes on the street, all of these physical factors influence what behaviors seem possible, what activities seem risky. Cities contain both kinds of spaces, areas of high visibility and social control, and areas that are marginal, less observed, where activities that avoid scrutiny can more easily occur. At night, cities transform. The business districts that are crowded during working hours empty. Entertainment districts fill. The subway trains that carry commuters at rush hour carry different populations in evening hours. Street life changes. Character workers going home are replaced by people going out, by those whose schedules don't follow 9-to-5 patterns, by populations who inhabit the urban night. This nocturnal city has its own ecology, its own patterns, its own populations adapted to operating when most people sleep. Cities accumulate wealth and poverty in close proximity. Affluent neighborhoods with expensive housing exist blocks away from areas of concentrated poverty. This juxtaposition is uniquely urban in rural areas. Rich and poor live farther apart simply because everyone lives farther apart. In cities, the density brings disparate populations into the same small geographic area, creating tensions, opportunities, and interactions that wouldn't occur with greater separation. Wealth creates demand for certain goods. Poverty creates willingness to take risks supplying them. The proximity makes connections between these populations easier. The city at dawn begins its daily transformation again. Street cleaners work through quiet hours. Early workers head to jobs. Stores and offices prepare to open. The night populations recede. The day populations emerge. Energy consumption rises as millions of people wake, turn on lights and appliances, begin their routines. The city's metabolism accelerates, its circulation quickens, and for another day it will function as this vast, complex, human-created ecosystem, housing millions of individual lives within the intricate web of infrastructure, economics, and social connection that makes urban life possible. Governed by laws of physics and shaped by evolutionary anatomy. The route the molecule takes, how it moves through different tissues, where it goes, and how quickly all of this depends on the molecule's chemical properties and the body's physiological systems. If cocaine is snorted as a powder, it first contacts the mucous membranes inside the nose. These membranes are rich with blood vessels close to the surface. This is why noses bleed easily, why they're effective at warming incoming air, and why substances absorbed through nasal tissue enter the bloodstream quickly. The cocaine powder, if pure, is actually a salt cocaine hydrochloride which dissolves in the aqueous mucus coating the nasal passages. Once dissolved, the cocaine molecules diffuse across the cell membranes of the nasal epithelium. This diffusion is passive, driven by concentration gradients. There's high concentration of cocaine on the outside of the membrane, low concentration on the inside, and the molecule, being relatively small and somewhat fat-soluble, can cross the lipid bilayer that forms the membrane structure. On the other side, the cocaine enters the interstitial fluid between cells and then crosses into the capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, whose walls are thin enough that small molecules can pass through. Once in the bloodstream, cocaine circulates. The blood leaving the nasal capillaries flows through veins that merge into larger veins, eventually reaching the heart. The heart pumps this blood through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where it releases carbon dioxide and picks up oxygen, then returns to the heart through pulmonary veins. From there, the oxygenated blood is pumped through the aorta and distributed to arteries throughout the body. This journey from nose to heart to lungs to heart to body takes less than a minute. The effects of intranasal cocaine are felt within a few minutes because the drug reaches the brain quite rapidly once it enters arterial circulation. If cocaine is injected directly into a vein, it reaches the brain even faster within seconds because it bypasses the absorption step and enters circulation immediately. Different routes of administration produce different timings of effect, but all ultimately deliver the molecule through the bloodstream to target tissues. The bloodstream is a highway system for molecules. Blood flows continuously, driven by the heart's rhythmic contractions, traveling through vessels that branch repeatedly, becoming smaller and smaller until they form capillary beds where exchange with surrounding tissues occurs. About 5 liters of blood circulate through an adult human, making a complete circuit roughly once per minute. This circulation delivers oxygen and nutrients to every cell in the body and removes waste products. It also distributes any drugs present in the blood, carrying them wherever blood flows. Cocaine in the bloodstream is not entirely free. Some percentage binds to proteins in blood plasma, primarily albumin, an abundant blood protein that binds many different molecules. The bound cocaine is temporarily inactive, not able to cross cell membranes or exert effects, but there's an equilibrium between bound and unbound cocaine, and as the unbound molecules are removed from blood by crossing into tissues or being metabolized, more cocaine unbinds from protein to maintain the equilibrium. This protein binding acts as a kind of buffer, creating a reservoir that releases drug gradually. The cocaine that remains unbound can cross from blood into tissues. This crossing is easiest where capillary walls are most permeable. Most capillaries in the body have relatively tight junctions between the endothelial cells that form their walls molecules can cross, but there's some selectivity based on size and fat solubility. In the brain, these junctions are even tighter, forming the blood-brain barrier, a selective filter that protects the brain from many substances in the blood. The blood-brain barrier presents a challenge for many drugs. It exists because brain tissue is highly sensitive, and uncontrolled entry of blood-borne substances could interfere with neural function. Endothelial cells and brain capillaries are joined by tight junctions that prevent most water-soluble molecules from passing between cells. To enter the brain, a molecule must either pass through the endothelial cells themselves or use one of the selective transporter proteins that ferry specific substances across. Cocaine, fortunately for its effects and unfortunately for its safety, crosses the blood-brain barrier readily. This is because cocaine is moderately fat-soluble. The cell membranes forming the barrier are lipid bilayers, and fat-soluble molecules can dissolve into these lipids and diffuse through. Cocaine is small enough and fat-soluble enough that it passes from blood to brain tissue without difficulty. Within minutes of entering the bloodstream, significant concentrations of cocaine reach the brain. Distribution throughout the body is not uniform. Different tissues receive different fractions of cardiac output. The brain, despite being only about 2% of body mass, receives about 15% of cardiac output because neural tissue has high metabolic demands and requires constant oxygen and glucose supply. This high blood flow means the brain receives proportionally more cocaine than many other organs. The heart, kidneys, and liver also receive high blood flow and accumulate drug quickly. Muscle tissue, fat, and bone receive less blood flow and accumulate drug more slowly. Fat tissue is particularly important for cocaine distribution. Because cocaine is somewhat fat-soluble, it can dissolve into adipose tissue. Fat acts as a reservoir. Cocaine diffuses into it from blood when blood levels are high, and diffuses back out into blood as blood levels fall. This creates a slower, secondary peak of blood levels after the initial peak, prolonging the drug's presence in the body even after the intense initial effects have faded. Meanwhile, the body is already beginning to eliminate the cocaine. The liver is the primary site of drug metabolism. Blood from the intestines and abdominal organs flows through the portal vein to the liver before continuing to the heart. And the liver is rich in enzymes that chemically modify foreign molecules. These enzymes, particularly a group called cytochrome P450 enzymes, evolved to detoxify plant compounds and other foreign substances that animals might ingest. They work by adding oxygen atoms to molecules, making them more water-soluble and easier to excrete. For cocaine, the main metabolic pathway involves enzymes called esterases. These cleave the ester bonds in the cocaine molecule, breaking it down into smaller pieces, primarily benzoylecgonine and egonine methyl ester. These metabolites are less active than cocaine itself, less able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and more water-soluble. The kidneys can filter them from blood and excrete them in urine. The liver also produces additional metabolites through other pathways, creating a mixture of breakdown products. The kidneys filter blood continuously, producing urine that carries away waste products and excess water. Small molecules like cocaine metabolites pass through the kidney's filtration system easily. They're concentrated in the urine and eventually excreted. This excretion gradually removes cocaine and its metabolites from the body, though the process takes hours to days to complete fully. The concept that describes drug elimination is half-life, the time it takes for blood concentration to decrease by half. Cocaine's half-life is about 1 hour, meaning that 1 hour after peak blood levels, half the cocaine has been metabolized or excreted. After another hour, half of what remained is gone, leaving 1/4 of the original amount. This exponential decay continues after 3 half-lives. About 12% remains. After 5, about 3%. For practical purposes, most of the drug is gone after several half-lives, though sensitive tests can detect metabolites for days after use. This journey through the body absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion determines how cocaine's effects unfold over time. The rapid entry into bloodstream and brain creates a quick onset of effects. The distribution into other tissues and beginning of metabolism means effects peak relatively quickly and then decline. The fat reservoir and continued release of drug from tissues means effects don't disappear instantly but fade gradually. And the metabolism to inactive products means that even after effects are gone, evidence of exposure remains detectable in urine for days. The body handles cocaine like it handles any foreign molecule, with systems evolved over millions of years to process plant toxins and other environmental chemicals. These systems work efficiently, breaking down the cocaine, preparing it for excretion, gradually returning the body to its baseline state. But before that happens, while cocaine is present in the brain in active form, it produces effects that are intense, specific, and powerful effects that require understanding the molecular machinery of neural communication. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, nerve cells specialized for electrical and chemical communication. Each neuron makes thousands of connections with other neurons, creating a network of unimaginable complexity. Information flows through this network as electrical signals traveling along neurons and chemical signals crossing between neurons. Everything we experience, every thought, sensation, emotion, and action emerges from patterns of activity in this neural network. Communication between neurons happens at specialized junctions called synapses. A typical synapse consists of a small gap about 20 nanometers wide between the sending neuron's axon terminal and the receiving neuron's dendrite. When an electrical signal reaches the axon terminal, it triggers the release of neurotransmitter molecules. These molecules diffuse rapidly across the synaptic gap and bind to receptor proteins on the receiving neuron's membrane, triggering electrical changes that either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron. This synaptic transmission is incredibly fast. The whole process from electrical signal to neurotransmitter release to receptor binding to electrical response takes just a few milliseconds. But the system requires precise control. Neurotransmitters must be cleared from the synaptic gap quickly, or they would continue stimulating receptors, causing signals to blur together. This clearing happens in two main ways. Enzymes in the synaptic space break down some neurotransmitters, and the sending neuron takes others back up through transporter proteins, recycling them for later use. Dopamine is one of several neurotransmitters that use this reuptake mechanism. Dopamine neurons are relatively rare in the brain, perhaps 500,000 of them among the billions of total neurons, but they're disproportionately important because of where they connect and what they signal. Dopamine pathways are involved in motivation, pleasure, movement, and reward learning. The feeling of enjoyment from food, sex, social connection, or accomplishment involves dopamine signaling. When a dopamine neuron fires, it releases dopamine molecules into synapses. These molecules bind to dopamine receptors on receiving neurons, triggering responses. Then, quickly, dopamine transporter proteins located on the surface of the sending neuron bind to dopamine molecules and pull them back inside. This reuptake typically occurs within milliseconds. The dopamine is then repackaged into vesicles inside the neuron, ready to be released again when the next electrical signal arrives. Cocaine interferes with this reuptake process. The cocaine molecule has a shape that allows it to bind to the dopamine transporter protein. When cocaine binds, it blocks the transporter. The protein can no longer grab dopamine molecules and bring them back inside the neuron. Dopamine that's been released into the synapse remains there, continues binding to receptors, continues generating signals in the receiving neuron. The normal, rapid clearing of dopamine is prevented, and dopamine accumulates in the synaptic space. This is not subtle. With transporters blocked, dopamine concentration in the synapse can increase tenfold or more. Receptors that would normally be briefly activated are now stimulated continuously. The receiving neurons, unable to distinguish this artificial sustained signal from a natural one, respond as if something extraordinarily rewarding is happening. The circuits involved in pleasure and motivation become hyperactive. The effects of this hyperactivation feel, subjectively, like intense pleasure and energy. Users describe euphoria, a powerful sense of well-being and satisfaction. They describe increased confidence, reduced fatigue, enhanced mental clarity, and feelings of competence and power. These feelings emerge from the artificial overstimulation of reward circuits that evolve to respond to genuinely rewarding experiences, like eating when hungry or succeeding. At difficult tasks, cocaine hijacks these circuits, creating the signal for extreme reward without the natural stimulus that would normally generate it. But dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter system cocaine affects. Cocaine also blocks reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin, though with different potencies. Norepinephrine is involved in arousal, alertness, and the body's stress response. Blocking its reuptake increases sympathetic nervous system activity, the fight or flight system. Heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, pupils dilate, and alertness sharpens. These physiological responses prepare the body for action, as if some threat or opportunity requires immediate response. The cardiovascular effects of cocaine are particularly pronounced because of this norepinephrine activity. Blood vessels constrict, increasing blood pressure. Heart rate accelerates. In a healthy young person, the cardiovascular system can usually handle this stress, though it's still causing unnecessary strain. In someone with existing heart disease, with atherosclerosis or arrhythmia or other cardiac problems, The added stress can trigger serious events, heart attacks, arrhythmias, strokes. These medical emergencies can occur even in relatively young users who seem otherwise healthy. Serotonin systems are also affected. Serotonin is involved in mood regulation, sleep-wake cycles, and many other functions. The acute effects of serotonin elevation during cocaine intoxication are less obvious than the dopamine and norepinephrine effects, but serotonin depletion after cocaine wears off may contribute to the crash that follows the period of fatigue, depression, and anhedonia that many users experience as the drug leaves their system. At the molecular level, all of this is happening simultaneously across millions of synapses. The cocaine molecules in the brain present at concentrations of perhaps a few micromolar are finding and binding to transporter proteins scattered across the brain's dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin neurons. The transporters that cocaine blocks represent just a tiny fraction of all the proteins in the brain, but their function is so important to normal neural communication that even partial blockade produces dramatic effects. The brain's response to this chemical disruption is complex. Initially, the overstimulation produces the euphoric effects, but even during this acute phase, compensatory mechanisms begin. Neurons respond to excessive stimulation by reducing receptor sensitivity, a process called downregulation. They alter the production of various signaling molecules. They change gene expression patterns to adapt to the altered chemical environment. These adaptations begin immediately, though their full effects take time to develop. The electrical activity of the brain changes noticeably during cocaine intoxication. EEG recordings show increased high-frequency activity. The brain is more active, more aroused. Blood flow to the brain increases, oxygen consumption rises, the metabolic rate of neural tissue climbs. All of this represents increased energy expenditure, increased demand on the brain's resources. The brain under cocaine stimulation is working harder than normal, burning through glucose and oxygen at elevated rates. There are regional differences in cocaine's effects. The ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens, parts of the brain's reward circuit, show particularly strong responses. The prefrontal cortex, involved in decision-making and impulse control, is also affected, possibly explaining the impaired judgment that often accompanies cocaine use. Motor areas show increased activity, contributing to the physical restlessness and increased movement users often display. The limbic system, involved in emotion, becomes hyperactive, potentially explaining the emotional intensity of the experience. Temperature regulation is affected. Cocaine increases metabolic rate and muscle activity while also constricting blood vessels that would normally dissipate heat through the skin. Body temperature can rise, sometimes dangerously, especially if cocaine is used in hot environments or during physical exertion like dancing. Hyperthermia, excessively high body temperature, can damage tissues, particularly in the brain, where temperatures above certain thresholds begin to denature proteins and damage cells. These effects unfold over a time course of minutes to hours. Peak effects occur perhaps 15 to 30 minutes after intranasal use, sooner with intravenous use, and then gradually decline as the cocaine is metabolized and excreted. The neurons slowly clear cocaine from their vicinity. Reuptake transporters gradually recover function, and neurotransmitter levels begin to normalize. But this normalization is not complete or immediate. The brain has adapted to the drug's presence, and when the drug leaves, those adaptations persist temporarily, causing effects in the opposite direction from the acute stimulation. As cocaine levels in the brain decline, the intense stimulation of reward circuits fades. The blocked dopamine transporters gradually clear, cocaine molecules unbind, are metabolized, diffuse away, and the transporters resume their normal function of removing dopamine from synapses. But the neurochemical environment the drug leaves behind is not the same as before. The sustained overstimulation has depleted neurotransmitter stores, altered receptor sensitivity, and activated compensatory mechanisms that now operate in an environment where the stimulating drug is absent. The most immediate consequence is neurotransmitter depletion. Dopamine neurons were releasing their stores continuously during the period of intoxication, faster than the neurons could synthesize new dopamine. The vesicles that store dopamine for release are partially emptied. When these neurons fire now, they release less dopamine than normal. The reward circuits that were hyperactive become hypoactive, less responsive to stimuli that would normally produce pleasure or motivation. This state is experienced as a crash, a period of fatigue, depression, inability to feel pleasure, and lack of motivation. Activities that would normally be enjoyable feel flat and uninteresting. Energy levels drop markedly. Fatigue is profound. The person may sleep for many hours. Mood drops below baseline, sometimes substantially. This is not simply the absence of the drug's positive effects. It's an active negative state produced by the neurochemical imbalances the drug has created. The severity and duration of this crash depend on several factors. Higher doses and longer periods of use produce more severe crashes because depletion is greater and compensatory changes are stronger. If someone uses cocaine repeatedly over hours or days without allowing recovery, each subsequent dose produces less intense positive effects and contributes to deeper depletion. This pattern of diminishing returns and increasing negative consequences is why cocaine binges often follow a pattern of escalating dose and frequency until the user finally crashes into exhausted sleep. Sleep itself is part of the recovery process. During sleep, especially deep sleep, the brain undergoes various restorative processes. Neurotransmitter synthesis continues, gradually refilling depleted stores. Cellular repair mechanisms work on damage from the period of intense activity and elevated temperature. Gene expression patterns shift toward restoration of baseline function. Sleep is not simply rest, it's active recovery, essential for returning the nervous system to normal operating condition. Appetite often rebounds during recovery. Cocaine suppresses appetite through multiple mechanisms: activation of satiety signals, increased metabolic rate, and perhaps simple preoccupation with the drug's other effects. When the drug wears off, appetite often returns intensely. The body has depleted energy stores during the period of stimulation and reduced eating, and hunger signals become strong. Eating helps restore glucose levels, provides amino acids needed for neurotransmitter synthesis, and supplies the calories needed for cellular repair. Hydration is also important. Stimulants increase water loss through sweating, through increased respiration, and through reduced attention to thirst during intoxication. Dehydration can worsen the crash, contributing to headaches, fatigue, and impaired cognitive function. Rehydration helps, though recovery is still gradual even with adequate fluid intake. The timeline of recovery from a single use of cocaine extends over days. The immediate crash, the period of exhaustion and depression, lasts perhaps 12 to 24 hours, but subtle effects persist longer. Mood might remain slightly depressed for days. Energy levels gradually recover. The capacity to experience pleasure slowly returns to normal as dopamine systems restore their function. Sleep patterns might be disrupted for several days, with excessive sleep initially followed by difficulty sleeping normally as circadian rhythms readjust. Repeated use complicates this recovery process significantly. If cocaine is used again before the nervous system has fully recovered from the previous use, the recovery baseline shifts. The brain adapts to the repeated disruption, and these adaptations, rather than being temporary, can become semi-permanent. Receptor levels change. Dopamine receptors downregulate, meaning fewer receptors are present on the receiving neuron's surfaces. This downregulation makes the brain less sensitive to dopamine, reducing the capacity to experience pleasure from natural rewards, even in the absence of the drug. This is the neurobiological basis of addiction. The brain has adapted to expect artificial overstimulation. Natural levels of dopamine signaling feel insufficient. pleasure from normal activities, food, social interaction. Accomplishment is diminished because the reward circuits have been recalibrated around the artificial highs produced by cocaine. This creates a motivation to use the drug again, not just to experience its positive effects, but to escape the depression and anhedonia that persist in its absence. Long-term changes can occur with chronic use. Brain imaging studies show altered activity patterns in prefrontal cortex and other regions. Cognitive testing reveals impairments in decision-making, impulse control, and memory. These changes can persist for months or years after cessation of use, though gradual recovery is possible with sustained abstinence. The brain retains plasticity, the ability to reorganize and heal, but this healing requires time and occurs more completely in younger individuals than older ones. Cardiovascular recovery follows its own timeline. Blood pressure and heart rate normalize within hours after cocaine clears from the system. But repeated use causes cumulative damage, accelerated atherosclerosis, weakened heart muscle, increased risk of arrhythmia. These effects don't reverse quickly. Someone with cocaine-induced heart damage faces elevated cardiac risk that persists even after drug use stops, though risk gradually decreases with time. The liver, which metabolized the cocaine, recovers relatively quickly unless damage has occurred. Cocaine itself is not highly hepatotoxic, though some metabolites can cause liver stress at high doses. The kidneys, which filtered metabolites, also typically recover without permanent damage unless extreme doses or combinations with other substances have caused acute injury. The body's remarkable resilience shows in this recovery. Systems that were profoundly disrupted gradually return to normal function. Neurotransmitter stores refill, receptor levels readjust, gene expression patterns shift back toward baseline, cellular damage is repaired. The body's homeostatic mechanisms evolved over hundreds of millions of years to maintain stable internal conditions despite external challenges work to restore the time. Balance that drug use disturbed, but this resilience has limits. Repeated severe disruptions can cause permanent changes. The teenage brain, still developing, is particularly vulnerable. Cocaine use during adolescence can alter developmental trajectories in ways that persist into adulthood. The aging brain, with reduced plasticity, recovers more slowly and less completely. The heart that has been repeatedly stressed accumulates damage. The reward circuits that have been repeatedly overstimulated may never fully regain their original sensitivity. And so the journey of cocaine from leaf to brain to aftermath traces a path through ecology, chemistry, physiology, and neuroscience. It begins with a plant that evolved a defense chemical in remote mountains. It passes through human chemistry that isolates and concentrates that chemical. It moves across geography through networks of trade and transport. It enters the human body and travels through blood to brain. It disrupts the molecular machinery of neural communication. And finally, it leaves, allowing the body to begin the slow process of recovery, of return to balance, of healing from the disruption. This entire chain, from the alkaloid accumulating in Coca leaves under Andean sun to the dopamine transporters blocked in a human brain to the gradual restoration of neurochemical balance, represents the intersection of botany, chemistry, neuroscience, and human behavior. The Coca plant knows nothing of human brains. The molecule has no purpose or intention. The brain's reward circuits evolved for purposes unrelated to this particular plant alkaloid. Yet when they meet plant compound and mammalian nervous system, profound effects emerge. Understanding this journey, this transformation from leaf to molecule to experience to aftermath, requires traveling through multiple scientific disciplines. The ecology of mountain ecosystems explains where coca grows. Organic chemistry explains the alkaloid's structure and properties. Physiology explains how it moves through the body. Neuroscience explains how it affects the brain. And all of this together explains why a plant growing in remote mountains produces effects that echo through urban societies thousands of miles away. Why this particular molecule has become entangled in human culture in ways both medicinal and harmful. Why the story of cocaine is ultimately a story about the intersection of plant chemistry and human neurobiology, played out across the geography and complexity of our modern world. As night returns to the Andes, the coca plants continue their quiet work of photosynthesis and alkaloid synthesis, unchanged by all that humans have made of their chemistry, simply growing as they have for millions of years, leaves accumulating molecules and patterns written in their genes, while far away, in cities across the globe, the consequences of that ancient chemistry continue to unfold in human lives, in individual decisions and collective patterns, in the ongoing interaction between a plant's defensive compound and the human search for alteration of consciousness and experience.